I could hear the soft hum of laughter floating through the house as I poured a glass of wine in the kitchen. Grace and her boyfriend, Evan, were in the living room, likely flipping through movies to watch. It was their usual Friday night ritual when Grace came home from college. She'd bring Evan, her new boyfriend of 6 months, a charming and polite young man who seemed to adore her. At least that was my first impression. As I leaned against the counter, I let myself relax, taking a sip of wine and letting the faint music from the living room fill the silence of my thoughts. The weeks had been long, work exhausting, and these little moments of peace felt like my sanctuary. I liked having Grace home. It brought life back to the house. But Evan's presence lately had felt different. The first time I met him, I thought he was sweet, attentive even. He had that easy charm young men develop when they know how to win people over. He called me Mrs. Monroe, complimented my cooking, and helped with the dishes after dinner. He seemed like the perfect match for Grace, and as her mother, I was happy to see her so content. But tonight, something was different. I'd caught him looking at me twice already. Not just casual glances, but something deeper, more deliberate, the kind of look that lingered just a moment too long, like he was trying to see past the surface. It made my skin prickle, and not in an entirely unpleasant way. As I entered the living room with the wine, I saw Grace curled up on one end of the couch, scrolling through her phone. Evan sat on the other end, his arm resting casually along the back of the couch. When I walked in, his eyes lifted from the screen to meet mine. It wasn't the look of someone politely acknowledging the host. It was something else entirely. Something that made me hesitate for a split second before I smiled. "Hey, Mom," Grace said, not looking up. "We're thinking about ordering pizza. You want anything?" "No, I'm good," I replied, my voice steady despite the odd tension I felt. Evan didn't say anything, but his gaze stayed on me for a moment longer before he turned back to Grace. I excused myself, retreating to the kitchen under the pretense of finding a book I'd left on the counter. As I stood there pretending to flip through the pages of a cookbook, I couldn't shake the feeling of his eyes on me. It was ridiculous, I told myself. He was just being polite, maybe curious about his girlfriend's mother. I tried to laugh it off, but the knot in my stomach told me I wasn't imagining things. Later, as they settled in to watch a movie, I made my way upstairs to give them privacy. I told myself it was better this way. Let them have their evening without me hovering around. But as I climbed the stairs, I couldn't help but glance back. Evan's head turned slightly, his eyes catching mine for just a fraction of a second. My breath hitched. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the moments from the evening. His glances, his demeanor, the way he seemed so present whenever I was in the room. It wasn't normal, was it? Or was I reading too much into something innocent? The next morning, Grace went out to meet some friends, leaving Evan alone in the house. I hadn't planned on interacting with him much, but as I was preparing breakfast, he wandered into the kitchen, his hair tousled from sleep. "Good morning, Mrs. Monroe," he said, his voice smooth and warm. "Good morning, Evan," I replied, keeping my focus on the eggs I was scrambling. He leaned against the counter, his presence filling the room. "Grace told me you're an amazing cook," he said. "Smells incredible." "Thank you," I said, offering a polite smile. He didn't move, just stood there watching me with that same lingering gaze. It made my chest tighten, and I busied myself with plating the food to avoid looking at him. "Do you ever take a break?" he asked suddenly, his tone teasing but gentle. I paused, glancing up at him. "Excuse me." "You're always doing something," he said, his smile softening. "Cooking, cleaning, taking care of everything. Don't you ever let someone take care of you?" His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. "I'm fine," I said finally, turning back to the stove. "You shouldn't have to do it all, you know," he added, his voice quieter now. I looked up, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged. There was something in the way he looked at me, something I couldn't quite place. I cleared my throat, breaking the tension. Grace will be back soon, I said, my voice firmer this time. You should go relax. He nodded, but there was a flicker of something in his expression, disappointment, perhaps. As he left the kitchen, I let out a shaky breath, my hands trembling slightly as I gripped the counter. That day, I couldn't stop thinking about his words, his tone, the way he looked at me like he saw something no one else did. I told myself it was harmless, that I was overthinking things. But deep down, I knew this wasn't normal, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to stop. This part establishes the emotional stakes and sets the tone for the forbidden tension that will continue to build. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. The next few days felt heavier, as though the air in the house had changed. Grace was busy with her friends, and Evan, for reasons I couldn't quite fathom, seemed to always be around. At first, I thought it was his way of being a supportive boyfriend, helping Grace settle back home and spending time with her family. But the way his attention lingered on me, the way he found reasons to stay close, it felt deliberate. That morning, I had planned a quiet day for myself. Grace had left early to meet her friends, and I assumed Evan had gone with her. But as I stepped into the kitchen, there he was, leaning casually against the counter with a cup of coffee in his hand. His hair was still slightly messy from sleep, and his casual smile sent a wave of unease through me. "Morning," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "Good morning," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I busied myself with the fruit bowl on the counter, avoiding his gaze as I reached for an orange. "You're always up early," he remarked. "Do you ever just sleep in?" I forced a small laugh. "Old habits, I guess. There's always something that needs to be done." "You should let someone else handle things sometimes," he said, his voice soft but pointed. "You deserve a break." He glanced at him then, and his eyes met mine with a sincerity that caught me off guard. His words seemed innocent enough, but there was something in his tone that lingered, something that made my stomach tighten. I turned back to the counter, peeling the orange as though it required all my concentration. "Grace will be back soon," I said, hoping to steer the conversation back to safe ground. "She texted me," he replied. "She'll be gone most of the day." The casualness of his words unsettled me. I felt his presence behind me, close enough that I could sense the warmth of his body. My hands froze for a moment, and I quickly busied myself with tidying up the already clean counter. "I'll be out of your way," he added, stepping back, though his voice carried a hint of something deeper. "I just didn't want you to feel alone." I turned to him, forcing a polite smile. "I'm fine, Evan, really." I nodded but didn't move, his eyes lingering on me in a way that felt too personal. "If you ever need anything, I'm here." Swallowed hard, my chest tightening as I watched him leave the kitchen. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, but the tension he left behind seemed to linger. I took a deep breath, trying to shake the unease, but the memory of his words, his gaze, clung to me. Later that day, as I folded laundry in the living room, I felt his presence before I saw him. Evan stepped into the room, holding a glass of water, his expression casual, but his eyes keenly observant. He sat down on the arm of the couch, watching me for a moment before speaking. "You do so much for everyone," he said, his tone gentle. "Grace, the house. You barely have time for yourself." I kept my focus on the clothes in front of me, but his words struck a chord. "It's just part of being a mom," I replied, folding a shirt with meticulous care. "Still," he said, leaning forward slightly, "you deserve to feel appreciated." I paused, my hands stilling for a moment. His voice carried a weight that made my pulse quicken. "Evan, I'm fine," I said firmly, though my voice felt too small in the quiet room. He hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. Finally he stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "If you say so," he said, his tone soft but laced with something that felt like a challenge. "But if you ever change your mind, I'm here." His words lingered in the air long after he'd left the room, and I found myself replaying them over and over and over in my mind. Was I imagining things? Was this all harmless? Or was there something more to the way he spoke to me, the way he looked at me? That evening, Grace returned home with a burst of energy, filling the house with her laughter and stories about her day. For a moment, the tension I'd felt with Evan seemed to fade, replaced by the familiar comfort of having my daughter near. But as the night went on, I couldn't help but notice how Evan's gaze seemed to shift between Grace and me, his smiles never lingering too long on either one of us. When Grace eventually went to bed, I stayed in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. The sound of the faucet filled the silence, grounding me as I tried to push the day's events out of my mind. But then, I heard footsteps behind me. "Need help?" Evan's voice was soft, almost tentative. I turned, surprised to see him standing there, his hands tucked into his pockets. "No, I'm almost done," I replied, my voice steady despite the sudden tension in the room. He stepped closer, his presence filling the space between us. "I don't want you to think I'm being too forward," he said, his tone low, but I can't help noticing how much you do. "How much you give." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. His gaze held mine, steady and unyielding, and for a moment, the air between us felt charged with something unspoken. "Good night, Mrs. Monroe," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned and walked away, leaving me standing there with my heart racing and my mind spinning. As I lay in bed that night, his words echoed in my mind. There was a line forming between us, one that I knew couldn't be crossed. But the more I tried to convince myself it was all harmless, the more I realized how fragile that line had become. The next day, I tried to maintain some distance, to create a sense of normalcy, but it was impossible to ignore the growing tension between Evan and me. Every glance, every word exchanged, felt layered with something I couldn't name but couldn't deny. It was like an invisible thread pulling us closer, no matter how hard I tried to resist. I was in the garden that afternoon, trimming the overgrown bushes along the fence. The warm sun beat down, and I could feel the sweat gathering at the back of my neck. I'd pulled my hair up into a messy bun, hoping to stave off the heat. As I worked, I heard footsteps approaching behind me. "Looks like hard work." Evan's voice came from over my shoulder, startling me. I turned, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "It keeps me busy," I said, trying to sound casual. He leaned against the fence, watching me with that familiar, steady gaze. "You shouldn't have to do all this alone," he said. "Where's Grace?" "She went out to meet her friends," I replied, turning back to the bushes. "I don't mind the work." "Let me help," he offered, stepping closer before I could protest. I tried to keep the interaction professional, pointing out what needed trimming, but his presence so close to me was overwhelming. The scent of his cologne mixed with the warmth of the sun, and I couldn't help but notice the way his shirt clung to his shoulders. As he reached past me to grab the clippers, his hand brushed against mine. It was such a small, fleeting contact, but it sent a jolt through me. I froze, my breath catching as he glanced at me, his eyes lingering. "Sorry," he said softly, though the corner of his mouth curled into a faint smile. "It's fine," I replied, my voice shaky as I turned back to the bushes, pretending to focus on the task at hand. But I couldn't focus. The proximity, the unspoken tension, it was suffocating. After a while, we finished trimming the bushes, and I went inside to wash my hands. I thought I'd finally have a moment to breathe, but when I turned from the sink, Evan was standing in the doorway, watching me. "Do you ever stop?" he asked, his voice low. I laughed nervously, reaching for a towel. "I'm just cleaning up." "You're always taking care of everyone," he said, stepping closer. "You never let anyone take care of you." The air between us felt heavy as he moved even closer, his gaze locking onto mine. I could feel my pulse quicken, my body betraying the rational part of my brain, screaming at me to walk away. "Evan," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't appropriate." "I know," he said softly, his hand brushing against my arm. But I can't stop thinking about you. The words hung in the air, and I felt my knees weaken. You're Grace's boyfriend, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. I know, he repeated, his voice full of emotion. But there's something between us. I know you feel it too. I stepped back, shaking my head. This isn't right, I whispered, my heart racing. He didn't move closer, but his eyes held mine, unflinching. Tell me you don't feel it, he said. Tell me, and I'll walk away. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I turned away, gripping the counter for support as my mind raced. For the rest of the day, I avoided him, keeping myself busy with chores and errands. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the memory of his words, the way he looked at me. That night, as I sat on the couch with a glass of wine, I heard the soft sound of footsteps approaching. I glanced up to see Evan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. I thought you might want some company, he said, his voice calm but charged. I hesitated, torn between asking him to leave and letting him stay. It's late, I said finally. Just for a few minutes, he replied, stepping into the room and sitting on the opposite end of the couch. The silence between us was deafening. I sipped my wine, trying to appear unaffected, but I could feel his eyes on me. Finally, he broke the silence. Do you ever let yourself just feel? He asked. I turned to him, frowning. What do you mean? Oh, always so composed, he said. So in control. But I can see it. You're holding back. His words struck a nerve, and I felt my defenses begin to crumble. Evan, this is dangerous, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Only if we let it be, he replied, his voice steady. Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was gentle but deliberate, and I didn't pull away. Instead, I looked at him, my chest tightening as the reality of the moment sank in. This can't happen, I said, though my voice lacked conviction. It already has, he said softly. For a moment, we sat there in silence, the weight of our unspoken feelings filling the room. Then, slowly, he leaned closer, his eyes searching mine for any sign of hesitation. When his lips met mine, it was tentative at first, almost questioning. But as I responded, the kiss deepened, and all the tension we'd been holding back spilled over. The moment felt surreal, like a dream I couldn't wake from. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as I melted into him. I knew it was wrong, knew there would be consequences. But in that instant, I couldn't bring myself to care. As we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I could hear his breath mingling with my own. This changes everything, he said softly. Yes, I replied, my voice trembling. It does. And deep down, I knew there was no turning back. The morning after felt heavier than any before. The house was quiet, but the silence only amplified the tension that had settled in my chest. I couldn't stop replaying the events of the night before. Evan's touch, his words, the way I had let myself cross a line I'd sworn never to approach. I told myself it would stop there, that I would create distance. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. By midday, Grace had left for another outing with friends, leaving Evan and me alone once more. I tried to keep busy, folding laundry in the living room. But every creak of the floorboards made my heart race, knowing he was somewhere nearby. When I heard his footsteps approaching, I forced myself to focus on the task in front of me. Do you need help? He asked, his voice softer than usual. No, I'm fine, I replied, not looking up. My hands trembled as I folded a towel, but I hoped he wouldn't notice. You've been avoiding me, he said, stepping closer. I froze, clutching the towel in my hands. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, my voice shaky. Ellie, he said, using my first name for the first time. The sound of it from his lips made my stomach tighten. You don't have to pretend. Not with me. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. Evan, this can't happen again, I said firmly, though my voice betrayed my resolve. What happened last night? It was a mistake. Was it? He asked, his gaze steady and unwavering, because it didn't feel like one. I opened my mouth to respond, but he stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. You can tell me to leave, he said softly, his hand brushing against mine. But if you don't mean it, don't say it. I should have told him to go. I should have put an end to it right then and there. But instead I stood frozen as his hand lingered on mine, his touch sending a jolt through me. Evan, this isn't fair, I whispered. Fair? He repeated, his voice laced with emotion. Do you think this is easy for me? Do you think I planned this? Because I didn't. He stepped closer, his eyes searching mine. But I can't help how I feel, he said. And I don't think you can either. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment I felt my walls begin to crumble. Evan, please, I said, tears welling in my eyes. This is wrong. It doesn't feel wrong, he said, his hand moving to cup my cheek. His touch was gentle, hesitant, as though giving me a chance to pull away. But I didn't. The tension between us grew unbearable, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine again. This kiss was different, more desperate, more charged with everything we'd been holding back. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as I melted into him. For a moment I let myself get lost in the warmth of his touch, in the way he whispered my name like it was the only word that mattered. But then reality crashed over me like a cold wave, and I pulled away, my chest heaving as I struggled to catch my breath. This has to stop, I said, my voice trembling. We can't keep doing this. Why not? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. We both know how we feel. His words shook me to my core, but I couldn't let myself give in. Because it's not just about us, I said. There are too many people who could get hurt. Then let's be careful, he said, his tone pleading. No one has to know. I shook my head, stepping back. It's not that simple, Evan, I said. It never is. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle but insistent. Ellie, I don't want to lose this, he said. I don't want to lose you. His words made my heart ache, but I forced myself to stay firm. You don't have me to lose, I said, though my voice broke as I spoke. This isn't real, Evan. It can't be. He looked at me for a long moment, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored my own. If that's how you feel, he said finally, his voice heavy with defeat. I'll leave you alone. He watched as he turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps echoing through the quiet house. As soon as he was gone, I sank onto the couch, my head in my hands. My heart felt like it was being torn in two. Part of me wanted to run after him, to tell him I didn't mean it, but the other part knew I had to stay strong. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of his touch, his words, the way he looked at me like I was the only thing that mattered. And for the first time, I wondered if I was strong enough to resist him, or if I even wanted to. The tension between Evan and me had become impossible to ignore. Every glance, every touch, every unspoken word felt heavier than the last. I tried to avoid him, to create space, but the house seemed smaller now, as though the walls themselves were conspiring to push us together. The weight of what had already happened loomed over me, a constant reminder of the line we'd crossed and the ones we were inching closer to. It was a quiet evening, with Grace out late again. I stayed in the kitchen after dinner, washing dishes and pretending not to hear Evan's footsteps approaching. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but insistent. Ellie, We need to talk. Ali turned, gripping the edge of the sink for support. Whipping the edge of the sink for support. There's nothing to talk about, Evan, I said, though my voice wavered. What happened before? It can't happen again. Why not? He asked, stepping closer. You keep saying that, but you never explain why. Because it's wrong, I said firmly, though the conviction in my voice felt hollow. He moved closer, his presence overwhelming. It doesn't feel wrong, he said, his gaze locking onto mine. It feels inevitable. Evan, you're Grace's boyfriend, I said, though the words felt like a lifeline I was clinging to rather than a firm boundary. And you're not Grace, he replied, his voice low and steady. You're different. You see me in a way she never has. He opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, as he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was electric, sending a shiver through me that I couldn't ignore. Tell me you don't feel it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Tell me, and I'll leave you alone. I turned away, closing my eyes as my heart raced. This isn't fair, I said, my voice trembling. To Grace, to us, he asked, stepping closer. What do you want? His question hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt my resolve crumble. It doesn't matter what I want, I said finally, though my voice lacked conviction. It matters to me, he said, his hand moving to cut my cheek. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate, that it made my chest ache. Ellie, I can't stop thinking about you. Evan, please, I whispered, though I didn't pull away. His thumb brushed against my skin, and my breath hitched. Tell me to stop, he said, his voice trembling. And I will. I opened my mouth, the words forming on my lips, but instead of pushing him away, I found myself leaning into his touch. His lips met mine, soft at first, as though testing the waters. But as I responded, the kiss deepened, and all the tension that had been building between us finally spilled over. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer as my fingers tangled in his hair. The kitchen faded away, leaving only the two of us in the charged silence. His touch gentle yet urgent, as though he was afraid this moment would slip away. Ellie, he murmured against my lips, his voice thick with emotion. I've wanted this for so long. Don't, I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. Don't say it. But he didn't stop, his hands moving to cradle my face as he pressed his forehead against mine. You don't have to pretend anymore, he said softly. Not with me. The sound of the front door opening shattered the moment like glass. We pulled apart, the reality of what we'd just done crashing down around us. Grace's voice echoed through the house as she called out, Mom? Evan? I stepped back, my chest heaving as I tried to collect myself. Evan's expression was a mix of regret and longing, but he quickly straightened, his composure returning. We can't do this, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Not again. Before he could respond, Grace entered the kitchen, her smile bright and oblivious to the tension that hung in the air. What are you two doing in here? She asked, her tone light and teasing. Just cleaning up, I said quickly, turning back to the sink. My hands trembled as I gripped the sponge, but I forced myself to keep moving. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The kiss, the way his touch lingered, the words he'd said, it all played on a loop in my mind. I knew we'd crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the weight of that realization was suffocating. But the worst part wasn't the guilt. It was the tiny voice in the back of my mind whispering that, given the chance, I might do it all over again.